think there's been kickbacks and corruption in democratic systems forever.
Yeah.
The question is, do you even have the shame to think we shouldn't be doing this? Or do you sort of brazenly say, well, they gave us a $400 million 747. Why wouldn't we take it? This
exactly
sort of
from Qatar. Yeah, exactly.
Qatar,
You're
exactly.
listening to Radio Free Mike. Hi, and welcome to Radio Free Mike, the podcast about freedom and its discontents. My name is Michael Scott Moore, and today we're talking to Dr. Brian Klaas, an American political scientist who works at University College London and writes essays for The Atlantic. His most recent book is Fluke, a study of chaos and random chance, but today we'll concentrate on a title of Brian's from 2022 called Corruptible, which deals with the wide variety of corruptions in modern politics, what conditions allow them to thrive, and how they can be starved of both water and light. Brian, welcome.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me on the show.
So your book is about corruption, and you describe several different kinds of corruption. Using various personalities, different people. And I thought that was a good place to start, especially with the one guy who was a school maintenance official, Steve Rauchi. Tell me about him.
Yeah, so Steve Rauchi worked in the Schenectady School District in New York, and he was effectively a janitor when he started, but he had, sort of huge ambitions. And what drives me to sort of tell this story is that when we normally think about power, we think about, people at the top, right? The presidents, the dictators, the prime ministers, all that sort of stuff. He's an illustration of how even at the smallest levels of power, it can corrode people's personalities. So, he tried to become a major kingpin in the union. He tried to sort of work his way up in the school. And what's really crazy is when people started to cross him, he started to do totally insane things. So vandalizing their homes, slashing their tires, hiding explosives in plants in the school. Ultimately, this sort of behavior of terrorizing his colleagues and so on led to him getting arrested and going to jail for quite a long time.
Right. And he ruled as kind of a tin pot dictator within the school district. Yeah,
exactly. And and it's pretty wild. I mean, he's sort of indicative of what a lot of psychologists, will call psychopathy. He clearly has a psychopathic tendency in his behavior. And I just think it's so extraordinary that when the stakes are that low, you can still have the same sorts of behaviors that manifest in dictators, right?
Right.
And this is the point I was making, is that there's sort of something about power, not about the sort of that's sort of intrinsic to power, as opposed to just being on the largest stages, that if you're a dictator, you'll do these things. People can do them in really petty ways as well.
Exactly. Well, tell us about how Steve Rauchi rose. I mean, it had to do with the heating of buildings, and that was such a funny story.
Yeah. So he he wanted to basically climb up the ladder. And so one of the things that the school district cared about was reducing heating bills, right? It was sort of in a cash crunch and all this. And so effectively there was, one of his rivals was put in charge of the sort of reduction of heating bills. And so he sort of volunteered to take on the task and said, I'll manage this for you and so on. And as he was doing this, he was actually trying to boost the electricity supply, the demands, on the sort of electricity bill. So he would turn on the scoreboard at the football stadium, when it was school holidays, just to drain as much juice as possible and so on.
Hoping to unseat the guy, his rival.
Exactly. Yeah. So it would get pinned on his rival, and then he would basically usurp him. And then at that point, he would actually cut down on the heating bill and take credit for it, so that he could show he's the sort of white knight.
Which worked, but then once he was in charge, he got angry at a teacher, for example, for complaining about the cold classrooms and installing a space heater.
Yeah, and I believe he cut the electrical cord of a space heater from a teacher at one point. And, it's the kind of stuff where it's just the sort of brazenness is amazing. What's also amazing is how long he got away with this behavior, right? And this is one of the key points around power, too, is when people misbehave, how quickly do they get caught? Because Rauchi was able to do this and terrorize his colleagues for quite a long time. And like I mean, to the level where when I was interviewing people for this story, I mean, they like talked about like trauma and like the support they had to get afterwards, and they were like really sensitive about it because he was just terrorizing their lives and making them worried about being at home and all sorts of stuff, all to sort of climb the pole in the Schenectady school district.
Right. So he wanted power, he grabbed power, and then his policy on heating the buildings changed.
Exactly.
So he struck me as sort of a narcissistic personality, but hard to diagnose from a distance. The other person you described who I found interesting was John Yoo, and he was a lawyer for the Bush administration who made some of the first coherent arguments in favor of torture after the Iraq invasion, or after or before. I think maybe after 9/11.
Yeah, exactly. So he's always had an expansive view of presidential power. This has been very consistent in his career, but he's basically known, and I think this will be, in his obituary eventually, as the guy who wrote the torture memos, as it were, and sort of justified, some of the ways in which, providing legal justifications for what I would describe as torture. And the reason I included him in the book was because I think it was just so fascinating the way he had this sort of mental ability to disconnect from the actual things he was thinking about in such a rational way, right? Like where the exercise of power was something that was like an intellectual puzzle, as opposed to actually people's lives being destroyed by this and intense suffering being justified and all that. So he was an interesting person to interview. He was very polite to me, and very, sort of kind and generous with his time and so on. So I appreciated that. But at the same time, I think some of the stuff he was justifying was really, really poisonous.
Well, but so that's one difference, right? He was totally rational as far as you could tell. He connected arguments in a fairly logical way. They might have been disconnected from the people he was affecting, but within himself as a lawyer, he seemed to be coherent, which is very different from Steve Rauchi. So Rauchi was incoherent and irrational, and John Yoo was hyper-rational.
Yeah, I mean, this is the kind of stuff where power can be exercised in abusive ways, through a lot of different pathways. One of them is obviously the sort of cold calculation of thinking that something is the means to an end, or thinking that it's legally justified and therefore acceptable, even if you discount all the moral questions and so on. And then there's also just the sort of impulsive psychopathy that Rauchi had. And what's very interesting on this is like, it brings it back to Rauchi slightly, but there's a lot of scientists who look at psychopaths who will say that there are like the successful and the unsuccessful ones, right? And like Rauchi was unsuccessful in a sense because he couldn't control his impulses, so he got caught, right? And
eventually got arrested, right?
Yeah, and like the successful psychopaths are those who, and I'm not suggesting John Yoo is a psychopath. I'm suggesting that the successful psychopaths in business and politics are those who are able to discipline themselves enough to not care about the suffering of others, and then package it in a more rationalist sort of way so that they can bring people on board, right? Because like you don't follow someone who's like purely vicious. Usually you try to say, oh, this is the greater good, or there's some sort of like larger emotional appeal. But yeah, I mean, the exercise and the abuse of power can be justified both psychologically and rationally, and it's very interesting to see the differences in how they manifest.
Right, but what do you think those two guys have in common? I mean, it's pretty simple to me, but
I think that they do not worry too much about the suffering of other people as a result of their actions.
And they both want to... I'm sorry to interrupt, but this has been a free preview of this episode. And the whole thing is open to paid subscribers to Radio Free Mike. So if you'd like to hear the rest, please hit the link in your show notes or in the body of the email we've sent you and upgrade your subscription over at Substack. Then you'll be able to listen to the full episode on any platform. Thanks for listening.